Welcome. The archive is now open. Tonight, from our restricted collection, we are unsealing one case file documenting the unexplained phenomena of the Brooks Range. The account you are about to hear is not fiction. It has been meticulously sourced from decommissioned military facility logs, geological survey transcripts, and recovered field audio recordings and preserved within this archive for professional review. The world believes these stories are lost to time. We ensure they are not forgotten. If you believe that certain knowledge must be preserved, subscribe to the Nocturnal archive and activate the notification bell to be alerted of our next acquisition. After reviewing these files, leave your own analysis or related experiences in the comments below. Now, find your comfort in the darkness. Let the noise of the day fade as we access the first file. Case File 492, Audio Transcript and Journal Reconstruction. Subject, Elias Thorne. My name is Elias Thorne. For 20 years I have served as a senior acoustic analyst for the Department of Decommissioned Infrastructure. My profession is not one that attracts attention, nor is it one that invites company. I listen to dying buildings. I listen to the groan of stressed steel, the microscopic fractures in concrete, and the shifting of foundations that have lost their war against gravity. I am an auditor of silence and structural decay. The data I am about to present concerns the final audit of the Brooks Range listening post, designated locally as the Sentinel. This facility, a relic of the Cold War meant to catch the whisper of Soviet aircraft over the polar cap, had been slated for demolition. My directive was routine. I was to spend 72 hours on site to map the acoustic integrity of the primary dome. The demolition team required precise data on load-bearing resonances to ensure the charges would bring the structure inward rather than scattering debris across the protected tundra. It was strictly a numbers game, a physics problem. There was no room in my equation for variables that did not adhere to the laws of thermodynamics. The insertion went according to protocol. The bush pilot, a man of few words who seemed to view the horizon with a permanent squint, set his Cessna down on the makeshift strip of packed snow and gravel 3 miles south of the facility. The engine of the aircraft was a violent intrusion in the landscape, a mechanical shout that seemed vulgar against the absolute white of the valley. We unloaded the equipment cases in silence. 4 Pelican cases, waterproof and shock-resistant, containing the sum total of my professional life. High-sensitivity piezoelectric sensors, omnidirectional microphones, miles of fiber optic cabling, and the central processing unit I referred to as the hub. The pilot did not linger. He checked the straps on his cargo, gave a single, curt nod, and taxied back toward the wind. I stood by my equipment and watched him leave. I waited until the drone of the engine faded, absorbed completely by the vast, indifferent geometry of the mountains. Then, the silence arrived. It is difficult to explain the quality of silence in the deep Alaskan interior to someone who has never stood at the edge of the habitable world. In the city, silence is merely the absence of noise. It is a pause. Here, silence is a physical weight. It is a pressure that pushes against the eardrums, a heavy, suffocating blanket that amplifies the sound of your own blood rushing through your veins. It is the sound of a world that has no use for biology. I adjusted the straps of my pack, checked the seal on my parka, and began the trek toward the dome. The air temperature was 22 degrees below zero. At this temperature, moisture is stripped from the air instantly. Each breath felt like inhaling crushed glass, a sharp, clean sensation that I had come to appreciate over the years. Cold air is stable. It is dense. It conducts sound with a clarity that humid, warm air can never achieve. For an acoustic analyst, the cold is a lens, sharpening the world. The Sentinel appeared on the horizon after an hour of hiking. It was a massive geodesic dome, a skeleton of triangular steel struts and deteriorating composite panels, half buried in 50 years of snowdrift. It looked less like a building and more like the carapace of some leviathan that had crawled out of the permafrost to die. The white paint had long since peeled away, revealing the gray, pitted metal beneath, which had rusted to the color of dried blood in the exposed joints. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of animal life. Even the caribou herds avoided this valley. It was a dead zone, purely inorganic. I reached the primary airlock on the southern face. The hydraulic mechanisms had frozen decades ago, fused into a solid block of ice and rust. I had anticipated this. I located the manual override panel, used a thermal lance to heat the locking bars, and applied a pry bar to the seal. With a shriek of tearing metal, a sound that echoed across the valley for miles, the door gave way. I stepped inside, and the wind died instantly. The interior of the Sentinel was a cathedral of shadows. The geodesic lattice overhead filtered the weak Arctic sunlight into complex, shifting geometric patterns on the floor. The air inside was stale, preserving the smell of 1,950 seconds industry ozone, machine oil, and the copper tang of old wiring. It was colder inside than out, a deep stillness that felt preserved in amber. I moved to the central control room, a glass-walled observation deck suspended in the center of the dome. This would be my base of operations. It offered a 360-degree view of the interior structure, allowing me to visually correlate the audio data I would be collecting. My first priority was the establishment of the baseline. In my line of work, you cannot detect an anomaly until you have perfectly defined what is normal. I began the ritual of unpacking. It is a process I perform with surgical precision. I opened the first case. The foam inserts held the sensors like jewels. I removed the primary sensor array, a device capable of detecting vibrations as subtle as a spider walking on a steel beam 50 feet away. I began the placement process. I walked the perimeter of the control deck, placing the magnetic sensors on the primary support struts at the cardinal points: north, south, east, and west. Next came the cabling. I ran the lines back to the central desk, taping them down with gaffer tape to prevent tripping hazards. Order is the defense against chaos. A tangled cable is a sign of a tangled mind. I powered up the hub. The screens flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over the dust-covered consoles of the original operators. I watched the boot sequence, the scrolling lines of white text, reassuring me that the logic of the machine was intact. The battery banks were showing a full charge. The solar array I had deployed outside was already trickling power into the system. I put on my headphones. These are not standard consumer headphones. They are industrial-grade isolation units, designed to block out 40 decibels of external noise. When I wear them, the world ceases to exist, replaced entirely by the input of my sensors. I flipped the switch to monitor. The sound of the station filled my ears. It was not silent. No building is ever truly silent. The Sentinel was singing its own low, mournful song. I heard the wind buffeting the exterior panels, a sound like distant, rolling thunder. I heard the thermal contraction of the steel beams high above as the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, a series of sharp, resonant pings and deep, groaning creaks. These were the sounds of physics, the sounds of metal expanding and contracting. They were predictable. They were safe. I spent the next 3 hours calibrating the sensitivity. I walked to the far end of the gantry, tapped a wrench against the railing, and watched the waveform spike on my monitor. I adjusted the gain until the tap registered clearly, distinct from the background wind. I repeated this process at 20 different points, building a three-dimensional acoustic map of the dome. By 1800 hours, the setup was complete. The station was wired. I was the spider in the center of a web of copper and silicon. If a bolt loosened, if a panel shifted, if a snowflake landed too heavily on the roof, I would know. I cleared a space on the main console, pushing aside a stack of yellowed logbooks that had been left behind during the evacuation in the late 80s. I set up my portable stove and brewed a pot of coffee. The smell of the dark roast filled the small glass room, pushing back the scent of old ozone. I sat in the command chair, wrapping my hands around the warm metal cup. Outside the glass, the light was failing. The shadows of the struts lengthened, stretching across the floor like the bars of a cage. The wind was picking up, whistling through the gaps in the outer shell. I checked the monitors one last time. The waveforms were steady, a rhythmic, gentle undulation of green lines representing the breathing of the building. Everything was within expected tolerances. Structural integrity was compromised, yes, but stable. The decay was linear, predictable. I opened my logbook and clicked my pen. Entry 001, I wrote. 19 hours. Deployment successful. Sensor array active and calibrated. Ambient noise floor is consistent with Class 4 desolate structure. Wind velocity increasing. Thermal contraction nominal. No anomalies detected. I closed the book and leaned back. I felt a profound sense of peace. The world was reduced to lines on a screen and the warm bitterness of coffee. There were no people here to lie, to make mistakes, or to introduce chaos. There was only the cold, the metal, and the math. I was alone, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. Safety, however, is often a byproduct of visibility, and as the Arctic twilight deepened into true night, the visibility vanished. The glass walls of the control deck, which had offered a commanding view of the dome's interior during the day, transformed as the sun dipped below the horizon. They ceased to be windows and became mirrors. The faint blue light of my monitor screens reflected against the glass, creating the illusion that I was suspended in a void, surrounded only by ghostly duplicates of my own data stream. Outside the dome, the world had been erased. The mountains, the snow, the sky, all of it was swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical substance pressing against the exterior panels. I turned away from the reflection and focused on the only reality that mattered, the screens. At 21 hours, I initiated the primary monitoring protocol. This is the core of my work, a process I call the deep listen. It requires a shift in consciousness. I am no longer a man sitting in a chair. I become a conduit for the sensors. I adjusted the noise-canceling headset, ensuring the seal around my ears was perfect. The silence of the room was replaced by the electronic noise floor of the system, a faint, clean hiss, like the sound of falling sand. This is the sound of electricity moving through copper. It is the canvas upon which all other sounds are painted. I closed my eyes and began to listen to the building breathe. The Sentinel, despite being abandoned for 40 years, was not dead. Large structures never truly die. They merely change their physiology. Without the hum of generators or the vibration of cooling fans, the station had reverted to a more primitive state. It reacted to the environment like a living organism. The first sound was the wind. On the monitors, it appeared as a chaotic, low-frequency rumble, a jagged green line that danced near the bottom of the graph. In my ears, it was a dull roar, muffled by the layers of steel and insulation. It sounded like the ocean, vast and rhythmic. The wind would build pressure against the northern face of the dome, causing the entire structure to flex microscopically. I could hear the strain in the rivets, a high-pitched creak that traveled down the support struts and registered on sensor 4. I typed a note into the log. Wind load increasing. North quadrant. Resonance frequency 45 Hz. Nominal. Then came the thermal contraction. This is the sound of cold conquering metal. As the temperature outside dropped further, approaching 30 degrees below zero, the steel skeleton of the dome began to shrink. This process is violent on a molecular level, but to the ear, it is musical. Ping. A sharp, metallic note rang out from the upper gantry. It was clear and bell-like, sustaining for 3 seconds before fading into the hiss. Snap. A louder sound, like a dry branch breaking, came from the lower levels. This was a bolt shifting in its housing, the friction overcome by the contracting steel. I watched the waveforms appear on the screen. Each sound generated a specific signature. The ping was a tall, thin spike. The snap was a dense block of noise. I recognized them instantly. I knew their source, their cause, and their physics. There was no mystery here, only the inevitable interaction of materials. For 3 hours, this was my world. I sat in the pale blue light, watching the green lines rise and fall. It was hypnotic. The rhythm of the station was slow and geological. It did not care that I was there. It did not care about history or politics. It simply existed, reacting to the cold and the wind with a blind, mechanical honesty. I found myself drifting into a state of professional trance. My breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the wind. My heart rate dropped. The cold of the control room, which hovered just above freezing thanks to a small propane heater, ceased to be uncomfortable and became merely a fact. This is the seduction of the job. The isolation strips away the complexity of human life. There are no bills to pay here, no interpersonal conflicts, no ambiguous social cues. There is only the signal and the noise. At midnight, I poured a second cup of coffee. The steam rose in a perfect vertical column, undisturbed by any draft. I checked the sensor integrity. All green. The battery banks were holding steady at 98%. The data drive was filling up with terabytes of high-fidelity silence. I leaned forward and adjusted the gain on the sub-bass frequencies. I wanted to hear the foundation. I wanted to hear the interface between the concrete pylons and the permafrost deep below the ice. The sound that came through was a low, steady drone. It was almost imperceptible, vibrating at the very edge of human hearing. It was the sound of the earth itself, a tectonic hum that underpins everything in Alaska. It was comforting. It felt solid. It reassured me that the station was anchored, that gravity was still in effect. I watched the spectral analyzer, a display that breaks sound down into its component frequencies. It showed a smooth, clean curve. No spikes, no irregularities. Just the smooth, sloping hill of natural background noise. I felt a profound sense of competence. I was the master of this environment. I had quantified it. I had measured its dimensions, its temperature, and its voice. There was nothing in this dome that I did not know. I took a sip of coffee, the liquid lukewarm now, and checked the time. 0:15. The shift was proceeding perfectly. I decided to run a diagnostic on the remote sensors in the server level, the deepest part of the facility, 3 floors down. It was a formality, a box to be checked. I keyed the command into the console. Query. Sensor array 7 through 12. The system pinged the remote units. A series of green lights illuminated on the dashboard. Status. Online. Signal strength. Optimal. Ambient temperature. Minus 28 degrees. I switched the audio feed to the lower levels. The sound changed. The wind was gone, buried under tons of concrete and ice. The thermal popping was distant, muffled by the intervening floors. The silence down there was different. It was heavier. It was a dead silence, thick and stagnant. The air in those rooms had not moved for decades. I listened for a full minute, straining to hear even the slightest variation. Nothing, just the flat, gray hiss of empty space. It was perfect, a tomb of absolute stillness. I reached for the logbook to make the entry. 0:20 hours. Lower levels secure. Acoustic profile indicates total stasis. No seismic activity. No structural settling. I wrote the words with a steady hand. I looked at the green line on the monitor, a flat horizon stretching out into the future. I felt the deep, satisfying fatigue of a job well done. The sentinel was sleeping, and I was its watchman, presiding over a kingdom of rust and ice that obeyed every law of physics I held dear. I sat back, letting the silence wash over me, unaware that the green line was about to betray me. The baseline had been established. The normalcy was absolute, and in the vacuum of that perfection, I was unprepared for the intrusion that was already gathering in the dark. Case file 492. Audio, transcript, and journal reconstruction. Continued. The intrusion did not arrive with fanfare. It did not announce itself with a crash or a scream. It arrived as a single, silent pixel on a liquid crystal display. The time was 02:14 inches, the morning. The control deck was submerged in a silence so profound it felt pressurized. The wind outside had died down completely, leaving the valley in a state of vacuum-like stillness. The only illumination came from the bank of monitors, casting a sickly, aquamarine light across the metal grating of the floor. I was midway through a routine data backup, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen when the anomaly occurred. It happened on Monitor 3, the screen dedicated to the low-frequency geophones I had placed on the foundation pylons. For the last 4 hours, that screen had shown a flat, unwavering green line, the visual representation of a dead building. Then, the line twitched. It was a small spasm, a sudden vertical spike in the waveform that rose and fell in less than a second. I blinked, assuming it was a trick of the tired eye, or perhaps a momentary surge in the power supply. I waited. 10 seconds passed. The line remained flat. I reached for my logbook to note the voltage irregularity. My pen hovered over the paper. Then, it happened again. This time, the spike was larger. It shot up the graph, peaked, and descended, but it did not return to the baseline immediately. The tail of the waveform dragged out, a jagged, decaying line that suggested friction. I froze. My hand lowered slowly to the console. I turned my head, straining my ears against the silence of the room. I listened for the cause. A falling icicle, a shifting plate of steel, a bird impacting the dome. There was nothing. The silence in the room was absolute. The air was still. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic rushing of my own pulse in my ears. I looked back at the screen. The disconnect between my eyes and my ears was jarring. Visually, the monitor was screaming. The green line was now pulsing regularly, a rhythmic, violent agitation of the data. But audibly, the station was attuned. I tapped the glass of the monitor, a superstitious gesture from a man who lived by logic. The reading was real. The sensor was picking up a vibration of significant amplitude. I initiated the frequency analysis tool. This software takes raw vibration data and breaks it down into its component parts, telling me exactly what kind of sound I am looking at. I watched the numbers scroll down the side of the screen. Frequency, 18.4 Hertz. I felt a cold knot of unease tighten in my stomach. 18.4 Hertz. This is the bottom edge of the infrasonic range. It is a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing. You cannot hear 18 Hertz, but you can feel it. It resonates with the fluid in the inner ear. It vibrates the globe of the eye. In psychoacoustic literature, it is often referred to as the fear frequency. It is known to induce feelings of nausea, sorrow, and inexplicable dread in test subjects. I sat very still in the command chair. I realized then that the unease I had been feeling for the last few minutes, the slight tightness in my chest, the vague sense that the room had grown smaller was not fatigue. It was a physical reaction to the sound. I was being bombarded by a noise I could not hear. I adjusted the volume on the headphone amplifier, pushing the gain to the maximum. I needed to hear the texture of the sound. I needed to know if it was mechanical or organic. I closed my eyes and pressed the headphones tight against my skull. At first, there was only the roar of the noise floor, the amplified hiss of the electronics. But then, cutting through the static, I heard it. Thump. It was dull, heavy, a wet, muffled impact, like a sack of wet sand being dropped on concrete. Drag. A long, scraping sound. Rough, abrasive, the sound of something heavy being pulled across a textured surface. Thump. Drag. The rhythm was agonizingly slow. There was a pause of exactly 6 seconds between each cycle. The regularity was mathematical. It possessed the cadence of a machine, a slow-moving piston or a heavy pendulum swinging in a viscous fluid. I opened my eyes and looked at the location data. The signal was not coming from the exterior. It was not the wind pushing against the dome. It was not the settling of the foundation. The signal was originating from Sensor 7. I pulled up the schematic of the facility. A wireframe map of the Sentinel rotated on the central screen. A small red dot pulsed in the lower quadrant. Sensor 7 was located 3 levels down in the sub-basement. Specifically, it was attached to the intake manifold of the emergency diesel generator room. I stared at the pulsing red dot. The logic of the situation began to fray. The generator room had been decommissioned in 1989. The diesel tanks had been drained and filled with sand to prevent environmental contamination. The generators themselves were massive blocks of rusted iron, seized up and frozen solid. There was no fuel. There was no electricity down there. There were no moving parts. And yet, the headphones did not lie. Thump. Drag. It sounded like labor. That was the only word that came to my mind. It did not sound like a random shifting of ice. It sounded purposeful. It sounded like effort. I began the process of rationalization. I am a scientist. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in variables I have not yet identified. I opened a new window on the console and brought up the atmospheric pressure readings. Perhaps there was a pressure differential, between the sealed lower levels and the surface. If a seal had failed, air could be rushing into the vacuum of the basement, creating a water hammer effect in the pipes, a rhythmic banging caused by air bubbles. I checked the barometric sensors. Stable, no pressure drop. I checked the thermal sensors. The temperature in the sub-basement was constant at -30 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, nothing moves. Oil turns to sludge. Rubber shatters like glass. I took off the headphones and laid them on the desk. Even from a foot away, I could see the drivers in the ear cups vibrating slightly with the force of the low-frequency pulse. I stood up and walked to the edge of the glass observation deck. I looked down into the dark belly of the dome. Below me, the gantry stairs spiraled down into the gloom, disappearing into the shadows of the lower levels. I gripped the railing. The metal was cold enough to burn my hand. I realized I was waiting for the sound to become audible. I was waiting for the thump to echo up the stairwell, to ring out in the open air of the dome. But the silence remained unbroken. The sound was trapped in the structure, vibrating through the steel and the concrete, bypassing the air entirely. It was a bone conduction transmission. The building was talking to itself. I returned to the desk and sat down. I watched the green lines spike and fall, thump, drag. It was getting louder. The amplitude on the graph was increasing. The vertical spikes were growing taller, pushing toward the red zone of the meter. Whatever was causing the vibration, the source was adding energy to the system. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, the physical symptom of the infrasound intensifying. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. The coffee in my cup on the desk began to ripple. Concentric rings of liquid radiated from the center, shimmering in the blue light of the monitors. I had to stop it. Not because I was afraid, I told myself, but because the vibration was interfering with the structural audit. I could not map the integrity of the dome if the sensors were being overwhelmed by this noise. I needed to isolate the variable. I needed to go down there. The thought formed in my mind with the cold clarity of a command. I did not want to go. Every instinct in my primate brain screamed at me to stay in the light of the control room, to lock the door, to wait for the sun. But I was not a primate. I was an analyst, and an anomaly is not a threat, it is a puzzle. I stood up and zipped my parka to the chin. I reached for the heavy flashlight on the equipment rack. Its weight was reassuring in my hand. I picked up a handheld frequency scanner, a small device that would allow me to track the signal strength as I moved. I looked at the monitor one last time. The rhythm was unchanged. Thump. 6 seconds. Drag. I turned off the overhead lights in the control room to let my eyes adjust to the dark. The blue glow of the screens cast long, strange shadows against the back wall. I stepped out of the control room and onto the metal grating of the gantry. The air outside the glass was colder, sharper. The silence of the dome was vast and indifferent. I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a swirl of dust motes suspended in the stagnant air. I pointed the light down, toward the spiral stairs, toward the dark throat of the facility. I took the first step down. The metal rang under my boot. Clang. The sound was shockingly loud. It echoed off the distant walls of the dome, returning to me seconds later as a ghostly distortion. I waited for the echo to die, and in the silence that followed, I checked the handheld scanner. The signal strength jumped. I was closer. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and began the descent, moving downward into the cold, following the sound of the heartbeat that shouldn't exist. Case file 492. Audio transcript and journal reconstruction continued. The descent into the sub-basement was not a journey into terror, as my adrenaline-flooded system had anticipated, but a journey into a deeper, more absolute form of stillness. I moved down the spiral staircase, the beam of my flashlight cutting a stark, white cone through the gloom. The metal steps were coated in a thin rime of frost that crunched softly under my boots, a sound that seemed deafening in the confined space of the stairwell. I reached the bottom landing. The air here was significantly colder, heavy with the weight of the earth pressing against the concrete walls. The smell of old diesel and ozone was stronger, a chemical memory of the facility's active life. I swept the flashlight across the corridor. It was empty. I checked the handheld frequency scanner. The signal strength was oscillating, but as I moved away from the stairwell and toward the generator room, the reading did not intensify. Instead, it became diffuse. The distinct, rhythmic pulse I had seen on the monitors upstairs, the thump and drag dissolved into a generalized, ambient vibration on the handheld unit. I pushed open the heavy steel door of the generator room. The hinges groaned, a dry, rusted complaint. The room was a mausoleum of industrial engineering. The massive diesel engines sat on their concrete plinths like sleeping iron beasts, covered in a shroud of gray dust that had likely settled undisturbed since the Berlin Wall fell. I walked the perimeter of the room. I shone my light into the intake manifolds. I checked the mounting bolts. Nothing moved. Nothing vibrated. The dust on the floor was unbroken by footprints. I stood in the center of the room for a long time, letting the silence settle around me. My breathing slowed. The tightness in my chest began to loosen. I felt a flush of embarrassment, the specific shame of a rational man who has allowed his imagination to override his intellect. There was no anomaly here. There was no intruder. There was only a cold, empty room and a sensor reading that I had misinterpreted. I returned to the control deck as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the ice-crusted panels of the dome. The sun does not rise quickly in the Arctic. It circles the horizon, a lazy, pale predator that offers light without warmth. With the return of the light, my scientific faculties returned fully. I sat at the console, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and looked at the data with the harsh scrutiny of the morning. The rhythmic spike on the monitor had vanished. The green line was flat again. I pulled up the architectural schematics of the Sentinel and overlaid them with the atmospheric data from the previous night. I began to calculate the variables: wind speed, barometric pressure, the volume of the internal air mass, the dimensions of the ventilation shafts. It took me less than an hour to find the answer. It was elegant, it was mathematical, and it was entirely natural. The phenomenon is known in acoustics as Helmholtz resonance. It is the same principle that causes a glass bottle to hum when you blow across its mouth. When air is forced across an opening into a cavity, the air inside the cavity vibrates at a specific frequency determined by the volume of the space. I traced the ventilation ducts on the blueprint. The main intake for the sub-basement was located on the northern face of the dome, positioned at an angle that would catch the prevailing wind. I ran the calculation. Given a wind speed of 30 knots, which we had experienced last night, and the cubic volume of the generator intake shaft, the resonant frequency produced would be exactly 18.4 hertz. I leaned back in the chair and laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound, but it felt good. The ghost was the wind. The heartbeat was simply the column of air in the shaft vibrating like a giant organ pipe. The rhythmic thump and drag was likely a loose damper or a metal flap in the intake assembly, swinging open and scraping shut as the pressure fluctuated. It was a loose shutter, that was all. I closed the logbook with a sense of finality. The mystery was solved. But as an analyst, my job was not just to identify the problem, but to rectify it. If I wanted clean data for the structural audit, I had to silence the noise. I had to fix the instrument. I spent the daylight hours of the second day performing maintenance. It was mundane, physical work, a welcome distraction from the cerebral tension of the night. I gathered my tools, a roll of heavy-duty industrial gaffer tape, a socket wrench set, and a bundle of tension straps. I exited the airlock and stepped out onto the exterior gantry. The wind had died down significantly, but the cold was biting. The landscape was a blinding sheet of white, the sun reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that required polarized goggles to endure. I climbed the external ladder to the northern intake vent. It was a large, rectangular opening covered by a steel grate. The metal was pitted and scarred by decades of ice storms. I inspected the assembly. Sure enough, inside the throat of the vent, I found the culprit. A heavy steel damper plate, designed to close off the shaft in case of fire, had come loose from its rusted hinges. It was hanging by a single bolt. I could see the physics of it clearly. When the wind hit the vent at the right angle, it would lift the heavy plate thump, and then, as the pressure released, the plate would slide back against the rusted housing drag. I reached through the grate with the wrench. The metal was so cold it radiated a phantom heat through my gloves. I tightened the remaining bolt, cranking it down until the rusted threads screamed in protest. Then, to be certain, I used the tension straps to lash the plate firmly against the wall of the shaft. I finished the job by sealing the edges of the intake with the gaffer tape, disrupting the airflow enough to prevent the resonance from forming. I worked methodically. I checked my work twice. I took satisfaction in the manual labor, in the simple cause and effect relationship of turning a wrench. This was how the world was supposed to work. If something is broken, you fix it. If something makes a noise, you silence it. By the time I finished, the sun was already dipping back toward the horizon. My fingers were stiff, and my breath had formed a mask of ice crystals on my scarf. But the silence was absolute. I placed my ear against the vent housing. There was no hum, no vibration, just the dead, solid feel of cold steel. I climbed down from the gantry and re-entered the airlock. The warmth of the interior, relative warmth, at least washed over me. I stripped off my heavy outer gear and returned to the control deck. I looked at the monitors. Sensor 7 was flat. The green line was a perfect, unwavering horizon. The interference was gone. I sat down and updated the log. Entry 002, 16 hours. Anomaly resolved. Source identified as loose damper plate in north intake vent B. Helmholtz resonance effect confirmed. Repairs effected. Signal noise eliminated. Acoustic environment returned to baseline. I felt a profound sense of order. The universe had threatened to be chaotic, to be unexplainable, but logic had prevailed. I had looked into the dark, and I had found a loose bolt. I spent the rest of the evening conducting the structural scans I had originally come to perform. The data was pristine. The silence in the dome was crisp and clean, providing a perfect backdrop for the delicate measurements of the piezoelectric sensors. I ate a simple dinner of rehydrated stew, heating the pouch on the propane stove. I read a few chapters of a paperback book I had brought with me. I felt the comfortable boredom of a routine shift. Around 22, I prepared for the night watch. I checked the battery levels. I checked the tape on the cables. I walked the perimeter of the glass deck, looking out into the dark cavern of the dome. It was quiet. The wind outside was merely a whisper now, unable to find purchase on the sealed vents. The singing of the station had stopped. I sat in the command chair and put the headphones back on. I wanted to hear the silence one last time before turning in for a few hours of sleep. I wanted to revel in the victory of silence. I flipped the switch. The hiss of the noise floor greeted me, a clean, white sound. I closed my eyes, letting the static wash over me. I was safe. The station was secured. The physics were sound. I drifted in that halfway state between wakefulness and sleep, lulled by the white noise. The tension of the previous night felt like a distant memory, a foolish overreaction. And then, the static changed. It did not come from the sub-basement this time. It did not come from the foundation. The sound that filtered through the headphones was faint, buried deep in the electronic haze, but it was distinct. It was a rhythmic modulation of the static itself, a pattern emerging from the randomness. Click, clack, click, clack. My eyes snapped open. I looked at the monitor. The green line was reacting, but it wasn't a low-frequency spike this time. It was a complex, high-frequency jitter. It sounded like a switch being thrown, or a key being tapped. Click, clack. And this time, the location marker on the screen wasn't pointing to the basement. It was pointing to the server room, the sealed, flooded chamber directly beneath my feet. The wind theory evaporated in an instant. The dampener was secured. The vents were taped. The wind does not click. The wind does not keep time. I sat frozen in the chair, the silence of the room pressing in on me as the rhythm in my ears grew sharper, clearer, and undeniably mechanical. Case file 492. Audio transcript and journal reconstruction continued. The clicking was not a random artifact of the atmosphere. It possessed a syntax. In the language of acoustics, random noise is chaotic. It has no pattern, no repetition, and no intent. It is the sound of rain, of wind, of electrons colliding in a vacuum. But this sound, this sharp, staccato click-clack was structured. It had a cadence. I sat frozen in the command chair, the headphones pressing tight against my skull as the realization washed over me. The wind theory was not merely incorrect, It was a desperate fiction I had constructed to preserve my own rationality. The damper plate was secured. The vents were taped. The air outside the dome was stagnant, hanging heavy and motionless in the frozen valley. Yet, the station was speaking. I forced myself to breathe. Panic is a variable that degrades data collection. I needed to treat this new input not as a threat, but as a signal fault, a technical issue. I told myself that it was likely electrical interference, a ground loop caused by the aging wiring in the walls, creating a rhythmic discharge that my sensors were interpreting as sound. I reached for the mixing console. My hands were steady, though I could feel a cold sweat breaking on the back of my neck. I initiated a diagnostic of the cable shielding. I checked the voltage stability of the preamps. All readings were nominal. The electrical system was clean. This was not a phantom voltage. It was a physical vibration. Something, somewhere in the structure, was moving. I turned my attention to the audio software. On the screen, the waveform of the clicking sound was jagged and distinct against the flat line of the background silence. I decided to clean the signal. I applied a high-pass filter to strip away the low-frequency rumble of the earth. Then, I applied a noise gate to silence the hiss of the electronics. The result was terrifyingly clear. In the isolation of the headphones, stripped of all interference, the sound revealed its true texture. It was the sound of a heavy, spring-loaded switch being thrown. Chunk, clack, pause, chunk, clack. It was the sound of a breaker, or perhaps a telegraph key, or the mechanical relay of an old mainframe computer engaging and disengaging. It had a metallic resonance, a tiny echo that followed each click, suggesting it was happening in a small, enclosed space. I looked at the location data. The red dot on the schematic was pulsing steadily. Sector 4, Level B2, the server room. I stared at the words on the screen, my mind struggling to reconcile the data with the physical reality of the facility. The server room was the heart of the original 1,950 seconds installation. It was where the vacuum tube computers and early magnetic tape drives had processed the radar data from the dew line, but according to the briefing documents I had memorized, the server room was a dead zone. In 1989, during the final week of operations, a pipe had burst in the cooling system. The room had flooded with thousands of gallons of glycol and water. Because the facility was being abandoned, no one had bothered to pump it out. The heating had been cut. The water had frozen. For 30 years, the server room had been a solid block of ice, a tomb of frozen machinery. I pulled up the archival blueprints for Level B2. The room was a sealed concrete box, accessible only by a single blast door that had been welded shut for safety. There was no power running to that sector. The conduits had been severed. Chunk, clack. The sound continued, indifferent to the impossibility of its own existence. I tried to visualize it. I imagined a switch, encased in solid ice, somehow finding the leverage to move. I imagined a relay arm, frozen in the glacier of coolant, snapping back and forth. The physics didn't work. Ice does not yield to mechanics, unless the room wasn't frozen, or unless the source of the sound was generating enough heat to carve out a pocket of movement. I adjusted the frequency scanner again. I noticed something else buried in the signal. Underneath the clicking, there was a second layer of sound. It was faint, like a whisper behind a wall. I drove the gain up higher. The hiss in the headphones became a roar, but the secondary sound floated to the surface. It was static, but not the white noise of the atmosphere. It was patterned, static. It rose and fell in pitch. It modulated. Whir, click, whir, click. It sounded like a tape reel spinning up. It sounded like data being accessed. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The station wasn't just making noise, it was processing. The infrastructure I had deemed dead, a simple skeleton of steel and rust, appeared to be attempting a boot sequence. I grabbed the thermal imaging camera from the equipment rack. I needed visual confirmation. Audio can be deceptive. Sound waves can travel through ductwork, bouncing and distorting until they emerge miles from their source. But heat does not lie. If a machine was running, if a switch was moving, there would be friction, there would be heat. I checked the battery on the thermal unit. Full charge. I looked at the heavy blast door of the control room. Beyond it lay the darkness of the gantry and the spiral stairs leading down to the silence, down to the ice. I did not want to leave the chair. The control room felt like a sanctuary, a glass bubble of logic in a sea of irrationality. But the analyst in me, the part of my brain that demanded answers, would not let me sit still. I could not log this as unexplained. There is no such thing as unexplained. There was only uninvestigated. I stood up. The movement felt stiff, mechanical. I unplugged the headphones, and the room was plunged back into silence. The click-clack was gone, trapped in the wires, leaving only the heavy, pressurized stillness of the dome. I zipped my parka. I put on my gloves. I picked up the thermal camera in one hand and the heavy flashlight in the other. I keyed the door release. The hydraulic hiss was startlingly loud. I stepped out onto the gantry. The cold was absolute. It hit me like a physical blow, a wall of air at 30 degrees below zero. My breath plumed in the flashlight beam, a frantic cloud of white that dissipated instantly. I walked to the edge of the walkway and looked down. The spiral staircase twisted away into the gloom, a helix of frosted metal descending into the throat of the facility. I began the climb down. 1 level, the air grew stale. 2 levels. The smell of ozone and old dust became overpowering. I reached the landing for level B2. The floor here was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I swept the flashlight beam across the corridor. It was a tunnel of concrete, lined with rusted conduits and bundles of decaying wire that hung from the ceiling like dead vines. At the end of the corridor stood the blast door to the server room. It was a massive slab of steel, painted a peeling industrial yellow. The weld marks around the frame were visible, thick scars of metal where the abandonment crew had sealed the tomb. I approached the door slowly. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It felt as if the air itself was waiting. I raised the thermal camera. I pointed the lens at the center of the steel door. The screen on the back of the camera flickered to life. It showed the door in shades of deep blue and purple, the colors of extreme cold. The steel was the same temperature as the surrounding concrete. Dead, inert. I moved closer, pressing the camera almost against the metal. I scanned the seams. I scanned the floor. Nothing. No heat leak. No friction bloom. I lowered the camera. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the sensor upstairs was malfunctioning after all. And then, I heard it. Not through the headphones, not through the sensors. I heard it with my own ears. Click. Clack. The sound was muffled, dull, coming from the other side of the 6-inch steel door. It was the sound of a latch engaging. Then, a low hum began, a vibration that I could feel through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the ground, it was the door itself. I raised the thermal camera again. On the screen, in the center of the deep purple door, a small, white spot appeared, a pinprick of heat. It grew. It expanded. It turned from white to yellow, then to red. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a fire. The heat signature was taking a shape. It elongated. It branched. I watched in a trance of absolute horror as the heat bloomed into the distinct, unmistakable silhouette of a hand pressing against the other side of the door. A hand made of heat, pushing from the inside of a room that was a solid block of ice. The hum grew louder. The click-clack accelerated into a rapid-fire chatter, and then the heat signature moved. It didn't fade. It slid. The hand slid down the metal surface of the door, leaving a streak of red warmth on the camera display, as if something on the other side was collapsing against the steel. I stood alone in the dark corridor, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, watching the impossible evidence of life in a room where nothing could live. Case file 492. Audio transcript and journal reconstruction. Continued. The heat signature on the blast door did not persist. I watched, the thermal camera trembling slightly in my grip as the red streak of the handprint began to cool. It faded from a vibrant, burning orange to a dull yellow, then to the bruise-colored purple of the surrounding steel. In less than 30 seconds, the thermal evidence had vanished, absorbed by the thermal mass of the blast door. The anomaly had returned to equilibrium. I stood in the corridor, the silence now punctuated only by the rhythmic click-clack that continued to emanate from behind the steel wall. The sound was muffled but persistent, like the ticking of a clock buried in a winter grave. My rational mind, the part of me trained to categorize and quantify, was struggling to process the data. Heat requires a source. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. For a heat signature of that intensity, roughly 98 degrees Fahrenheit, to manifest on a surface that was 30 degrees below zero, there had to be a biological engine. There had to be blood. There had to be metabolism. But the server room was a sealed environment. It was a tomb. I needed visual confirmation. I could not rely on the thermal conductivity of the door alone. I needed to see the interior space. I moved the beam of my flashlight along the wall adjacent to the blast door. According to the blueprints I had memorized, there was an observation port, a reinforced window used by the technicians of the 1,950 seconds to monitor the mainframe without entering the climate-controlled environment. I found it 2 feet to the right of the door frame. It was a rectangular pane of leaded glass, roughly 12 inches high and 2 feet wide, set deep into the concrete. Over the decades, the glass had become obscured by a thick layer of grime and rime ice. It looked like a cataract on a blind eye. I used the sleeve of my parka to wipe away the frost. The ice was stubborn, clinging to the glass, but eventually, I cleared a patch large enough to act as a viewport. I raised the flashlight and pressed the lens against the glass, directing the beam into the room beyond. The light cut through the darkness, revealing a landscape of frozen devastation. The server room was, as the reports had stated, a flooded ruin. The burst pipe had filled the chamber with 3 feet of water and glycol coolant before the freeze set in. The floor was a solid, opaque sheet of dark ice. Rising from this frozen lake were the rows of server racks, tall, black monoliths of rusted steel that housed the reel-to-reel tape drives and vacuum tube processors of the Cold War era. The air inside the room was thick with suspended ice crystals, sparkling in my flashlight beam like diamond dust. Stalactites of frozen condensation hung from the ceiling cables, pointing down toward the machinery like jagged teeth. It was a still life of industrial death. Nothing moved. There was no air circulation. There was no vibration. The dust on the tops of the server racks was undisturbed. I swept the light back and forth. I looked for a source of the sound. I looked for a machine that might still be cycling. I looked for a rat, a bird, anything that could explain the noise. There was nothing. To the naked eye, the room was dead, and yet, through the glass, the sound was louder. Click, clack. It was crisp, mechanical. It was coming from the center of the room, from the aisle between the second and third row of server racks. I lowered the flashlight and raised the thermal camera. I pressed the rubber eyepiece against the lens of my safety goggles. The screen flickered, adjusting its dynamic range to the extreme cold of the interior. The room appeared on the screen in shades of deep, abyssal blue and black. The ice on the floor was a uniform void of cold. The metal racks were dark purple towers. I panned the camera slowly to the right, following the aisle. Blue, purple, black. And then, in the center of the room, the color spectrum exploded. A bloom of bright, violent red appeared in the middle of the frozen aisle. I stopped breathing. I adjusted the focus ring, my fingers clumsy in their heavy gloves. The image sharpened. The red blob resolved into a shape. It was a distinct, coherent heat signature. It was the thermal silhouette of a man. He, or it, was sitting at a small operator's console that jutted out from the main server bank. To my naked eye, checking the window again, there was nothing there. The chair was empty. The console was a rusted hulk covered in frost. But through the thermal camera, the figure was blazing with energy. I could see the definition of the shoulders, hunched slightly forward in a posture of focus. I could see the heat radiating from the neck and the back of the head. The core temperature was consistent with a living human being. The figure was not static. It was moving. I watched as the thermal arms extended toward the frozen keyboard of the console. The hands, bright orange on the display, moved with practiced, rhythmic precision. Click. The figure pressed a key. Clack. The figure released it. The sound I was hearing matched the movement perfectly. The ghost was not a spirit of vapor or mist. It was a phantom of pure heat, acting out a loop of labor in a room where physics dictated it should not exist. I stood there for what felt like minutes, oscillating between two realities. I would look through the glass with my eyes and see an empty, frozen chair. I would look through the camera and see a man burning with life, working diligently at his station. The cognitive dissonance was nauseating. My brain tried to reject the evidence. It tried to tell me that the camera was malfunctioning, that the sensor was picking up a reflection, a hot spot in the wiring, but the movement was too fluid. The posture was too human. The figure stopped typing. It paused. I saw the thermal head tilt slightly to the side, as if reading a monitor that no longer existed. Then, it reached out and flipped a switch on the console. Chunk. The sound resonated through the glass. I looked at the console with my naked eye. The physical switch, a rusted toggle lever, did not move. It remained frozen in the off position, encased in a layer of ice. The entity was interacting with the memory of the machine. It was operating a version of the room that existed in a different time, or a different state of reality. The heat it generated was real, my camera proved that, but its physical interaction with the world was decoupled. I zoomed the camera in further. I wanted to see the face. I wanted to see who was manning the dead station. The resolution of the thermal image was coarse, pixelated, but I could make out the profile. A high collar, short hair. The heat signature around the face was intense, glowing white-hot at the eyes and mouth. He was working with an intensity that suggested urgency. The typing resumed. Faster now. Click, click, click. Clack. He was inputting data. He was transmitting. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of voyeurism. I was an intruder here. This was not a haunting. This was a shift. I was watching a man at work. A man who perhaps did not know that his shift had ended 40 years ago. I was watching the persistence of duty beyond the threshold of death. The cold of the corridor seemed to seep into my bones, bypassing the insulation of my parka. I realized that the fear frequency, the 18, 4 Hz hum was emanating from him. It was the vibration of his presence. The sheer energy required to maintain that heat signature in this absolute zero environment was generating a shockwave that my sensors had picked up 3 floors above. I was looking at the source of the anomaly. I had found the glitch. And then, the pattern changed. The typing stopped abruptly. The rhythmic click-clack ceased, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in the corridor. On the thermal display, the figure went rigid. The hunched posture of work vanished. The spine straightened. The heat signature flared. The red turned to white. The intensity of the thermal output spiked. Slowly, with the grinding deliberation of a rusted hinge, the figure began to turn. It was rotating in the chair. It was turning away from the console. It was turning toward the window. It was turning toward me. Case file 492. Audio transcript and journal reconstruction. Continued. The rotation was not an act of aggression, but of acknowledgement. It possessed the terrifying, hydraulic smoothness of a turret tracking a target. I stood paralyzed in the corridor, the flashlight beam shaking violently in my left hand, while my right hand gripped the thermal camera with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a raft. Through the digital viewfinder, I watched the heat signature complete its turn. The figure was now facing the window directly, facing me. The profile view had offered some comfort, the abstraction of a shape at work, but the full frontal view destroyed that distance. The thermal display showed a humanoid form of blinding white intensity. The heat was concentrated in the center of the mass, radiating outward in gradients of orange and red. There were no features. A thermal camera does not see skin or bone. It sees only the emission of energy. Where the eyes should have been, there were 2 pools of cooler, darker orange, set deep within the blazing white of the skull. Where the mouth should have been, there was a thin, tight line of heat. It was a face of pure thermodynamics, a mask of burning energy staring out from a room of absolute zero. I lowered the camera for a fraction of a second, compelled by a primitive need to verify reality with my own eyes. Through the dirty glass, the room remained empty. The chair was vacant. The ice was undisturbed. The darkness was total. I raised the camera again. The figure was still there. It had not moved. It was simply watching me. The silence in the corridor changed. The rhythmic click-clack of the phantom typing had ceased entirely. In its place, a new sound began to emerge from the walls, from the floor, from the very air of the facility. It started as a low whine, barely audible, at the very edge of perception. It rose steadily in pitch, a smooth, climbing glissando that bypassed the ears and seemed to vibrate directly in the teeth. I recognized the sound immediately. It was an acoustic feedback loop. It is the sound produced when a microphone picks up its own output from a speaker, amplifying the signal in an infinite, screaming circle until the system fails. But there were no speakers here. There were no microphones. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The feedback was not electronic. It was ontological. I was the microphone. The entity was the speaker. We were observing each other, and the loop was closing. The laws of physics in this corridor were bending under the weight of two incompatible realities trying to occupy the same space at the same time. The heat signature on the screen began to flare. The edges of the figure vibrated, blurring slightly, as if the energy containment was failing. The high-pitched whine grew louder. It was a pure sine wave, piercing and clean. It filled the corridor, drowning out the hum of the ventilation, the beat of my heart, the rasp of my breathing. I tried to step back. My legs refused to move. I was pinned by the gaze of the thermal ghost. The figure raised a hand. The motion was slow, deliberate. The arm lifted from the armrest of the invisible chair. The white-hot hand floated upward, leaving a trail of red tracers on the camera screen. I flinched, expecting a gesture of warning, or perhaps a strike. I expected the violence of a poltergeist, the chaotic lashing out of a trapped spirit. But the gesture was precise. It was bureaucratic. The figure extended its index finger and pressed it vertically against where its lips would be, the universal sign for silence. Shh. The message was not a threat. It was a correction. I understood then, with a clarity that froze my blood more effectively than the Arctic air, what I was witnessing. I was not the protagonist of the scene. I was not the investigator uncovering a mystery. I was the noise. I was the anomaly. This entity, this recording, this memory, this thermal ghost was trying to work. It was trying to complete its shift, to input its data, to maintain the vigil it had started 40 years ago. My presence, my heat, my breathing, my clumsy investigation. I was the interference. I was the static on the line. The figure held the pose. The finger pressed against the face. The burning white gaze locked onto my position through the leaded glass. The sine wave reached a crescendo, a single, piercing note that threatened to shatter the glass of the observation window. It was the sound of a system pushed to its limit. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my ears. I looked down at the handheld frequency scanner clipped to my belt. The screen was black. The overload light was blinking red. The device had burned out. The equipment was failing. The reality of the corridor was becoming unstable. I had to disconnect. I forced my muscles to obey. I broke the line of sight. I lowered the thermal camera and turned my back on the window. The movement broke the spell. The feedback whine cut out instantly, snapping into silence as if a cable had been severed. I did not run. Running is a prey response, and I refused to be prey. I moved with the rigid, jerky motions of a machine that has been damaged. I walked back down the corridor, placing one foot carefully in front of the other. I did not look back. I knew that if I turned around, I would see the thermal glow bleeding through the glass, staining the concrete walls with the light of a dead sun. I reached the spiral staircase. I gripped the railing with both hands, hauling myself up the steps. The metal burned my palms through the gloves. 1 flight. The air grew thinner. 2 flights. The smell of ozone faded. I reached the gantry level. I stepped through the blast door of the control room and hit the seal mechanism. The hydraulics hissed. A sound of sealing, of safety. The heavy door slid shut, locking with a thud that vibrated through the floor. I stood in the center of the control room, gasping for air. The monitors were still glowing with their pale blue light. The coffee cup was still sitting on the console. The logbook was open to the last page. It was a scene of perfect normalcy, but the room felt different now. The sanctuary, was compromised. I looked at the main monitor. The green line was flat. The sensor in the sub-basement was reading silence. Absolute, total silence. But I knew better. I walked to the main breaker panel on the wall. I did not hesitate. I pulled the master lever for the lower levels. The lights on the board died. The sensors in the basement went dark. I cut the power. I cut the feed. I blinded the system. I did not want to know if he was still typing. I did not want to see the heat signature again. I sat down in the command chair and turned it to face the door. I placed the thermal camera on the desk, lens facing away from me. I placed the flashlight next to it. I waited. I waited for the sound of footsteps on the gantry. I waited for the hiss of the door override. I waited for the heat to follow me up the stairs. But nothing came. The dome remained silent. The wind outside whispered against the panels, a soft, chaotic scratching that sounded like nothing at all. The entity had not followed. It had no interest in me. I was merely an interruption that had been removed. I had been silenced. And now, the work could continue. I checked my watch. It was 3:30. The sun would not rise for another 6 hours. I knew I would not sleep. I knew I would not write in the logbook. There were no words in the technical vocabulary of the Department of Infrastructure to describe a ghost that asks for quiet. I simply sat in the dark, watching the flat green line on the remaining monitors, listening to the hum of the hard drives, and trying to forget the image of the burning white hand raised in a gesture of eternal, polite dismissal. Case file 492. Audio transcript and journal reconstruction. Continued. The sun returned to the Brooks Range with agonizing slowness. It did not burst over the horizon. Rather, it bled into the sky, turning the black of the night into a bruised purple, then to a cold, slate gray. I watched this transition from the command chair, my eyes fixed on the curve of the geodesic dome above the control deck. I had not moved for 6 hours. I had not slept. I had simply maintained my post, a silent observer in a tower of glass, respecting the boundary that had been drawn in the dark. At 9 hours, the light inside the dome was sufficient to see the gantry clearly without the aid of artificial illumination. The shadows retreated to the corners. The facility returned to its appearance of benign neglect, a collection of rusted steel and dust. I stood up. My joints were stiff, locked by the cold and the tension of the vigil. It was time to initiate the withdrawal protocols. In any other engagement, demobilization is a routine procedure. It is loud. It involves the clatter of equipment, the snapping of latches, the tearing of tape. It is the sound of a job finishing. But on this morning, I moved with the deliberate quiet of a thief in a cathedral. I did not want to make a sound that might travel down the ventilation shafts. I did not want to send a vibration through the floor that might register on a console 3 levels down. I began to dismantle the hub. I powered down the monitors one by one. The blue glow vanished, leaving the screens dark and reflective. I coiled the fiber optic cables, winding them in perfect circles, securing them with Velcro ties. I placed the frequency analyzers back into their foam-lined cases. I worked systematically from the perimeter inward. I retrieved the sensors from the upper gantry. I retrieved the geophones from the support struts, but I did not retrieve the sensors from the sub-basement. I looked at the cable bundle running through the conduit to the lower levels. To retrieve those sensors, I would have to go back down. I would have to open the blast door. I would have to descend the spiral stairs into the ozone and the cold. I made a command decision. I took a pair of wire cutters from my belt. I located the main feed line for the sub-basement array. With a single, clean motion, I severed the cable. The copper ends gleamed brightly in the gray light. I taped the cut ends down, securing them to the floor. I would mark the equipment as lost in field on the inventory manifest. It was a small price to pay for maintaining the quarantine. However, I could not leave without leaving something behind. An analyst always craves data, even when he is too afraid to collect it himself. I opened the smallest of my equipment cases and removed a standalone, battery-operated audio recorder. It was a solid-state unit, capable of recording high-fidelity audio for 30 days on a single charge. I set the recording quality to maximum. I placed the device on the main console, directly in the center of the desk. I pointed the internal microphones toward the blast door. I pressed record. A tiny red light began to blink. It was a passive observer, a mechanical ear left to bear witness to whatever might happen in the silence after I was gone. It was a tithe to the building, acknowledgement that while my shift was over, the station's work continued. I finished packing the final Pelican case. I zipped my parka and pulled on my heavy mittens. I took one last look around the control room. It was clean, sterile. It looked exactly as it had when I arrived, save for the blinking red eye of the recorder on the desk. I exited the control room and sealed the door. I spun the locking wheel until it seated with a heavy metallic thud. I checked the seal. It was tight. I walked across the gantry to the main airlock. The sound of my boots on the grating seemed impossibly loud, a desecration of the stillness. I found myself flinching at the echo, waiting for a reprimand from below. But none came. The station was indifferent to my departure. I stepped through the airlock and into the blinding white of the exterior world. The cold hit me, but it felt different now. It felt clean. It was the simple, honest cold of nature, not the heavy, pressurized cold of the time capsule I had just exited. I closed the outer door and engaged the locking mechanism. I hammered the latch home with the heel of my hand, freezing the mechanism shut. I picked up the 2 heavy equipment cases, one in each hand, and began the trek back to the airstrip. I walked away from the dome without looking back. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing and the crunch of the snow under my boots. I focused on the horizon, where the jagged peaks of the Brooks Range tore at the sky. I reached the landing strip an hour later. I set the cases down in the snow and retrieved the satellite phone from my pocket. I dialed the dispatch number for the bush pilot. Thorn to dispatch. Extraction requested. Site secure. Ready for pickup. The voice of the dispatcher crackled in my ear, distorted by the atmospheric static. Copy that, Thorn. Bird is inbound. ETA. 20 minutes. I waited. I stood alone on the frozen plain, a small black speck in a world of white. The wind kicked up snow around my boots, burying the equipment cases in a fine drift. The sound of the plane arrived before the visual, a low drone growing steadily into a roar. It was a mechanical, combustion-driven sound. It was the sound of the modern world. It was ugly, and it was beautiful. The Cessna touched down, its skis bouncing on the uneven snow. The pilot taxied to where I stood and killed the engine. The propeller spun down to a halt. He opened the door and hopped out, his face hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. He looked at me, then at the equipment. "Done early?" he asked. His voice was loud, too loud. "Job's finished," I said. My own voice sounded foreign to me, thin and brittle. "Load it up." We loaded the cases into the cargo hold in silence. I climbed into the passenger seat and buckled the harness. The interior of the plane smelled of aviation fuel and stale coffee. It smelled like life. The pilot fired the engine. The plane shuddered, vibrating with a frequency that was chaotic and reassuring. We gathered speed, the skis rattling over the ice, until the ground fell away beneath us. We banked sharply to the south, climbing toward the mountain pass. As we gained altitude, I looked out the window. I could not help myself. I had to see it one last time. Below us, the Sentinel was a gray geometric scar on the pristine white valley. From this height, the geodesic structure lost its architectural nuance. It looked skeletal. The snow had drifted against the northern face, piling up around the intake vents I had taped shut. The wind had scoured the top of the dome clean. As I watched, the angle of the sun shifted, casting the shadow of the mountain across the valley floor. The shadow swallowed the station. For a fleeting second, the pattern of the rusted struts and the dark, recessed openings of the ventilation shafts aligned in a way I had not seen from the ground. It looked like a skull, half buried in the earth, staring up at the sky with empty, triangular eye sockets. And then we crested the ridge, and the station was gone. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. The vibration of the plane hummed against my spine. It was a rough, uneven vibration. It had no syntax. It had no code. I kept my eyes closed for the entire flight back to Fairbanks. I was afraid that if I opened them, I would see a heat signature on the instrument panel. I was afraid I would see a hand made of fire reaching for the controls. I was safe. I was leaving. But a part of me, the part that understands the persistence of data, knew that I was leaving something behind. I had left a piece of the present in that room, and in the silence of the sub-basement, in the dark and the cold, the thermal ghost was still there, waiting for the recorder to run out of tape, waiting for the silence to be absolute once more, waiting to get back to work. Case file 492, audio transcript and journal reconstruction, final entry. The laboratory of the Department of Decommissioned Infrastructure is located 3,000 miles south of the Brooks Range in a climate-controlled basement in Seattle. It is a space designed for objectivity. The walls are soundproofed, painted a neutral, sterile white. The air is filtered, scrubbed of all particulate matter, and maintained at a constant 68 degrees. There is no wind here. There is no ice. There is only the hum of the server banks and the fluorescent buzz of the overhead lights. I returned to this sanctuary 48 hours after lifting off from the airstrip. My physical transition was complete. I had showered the smell of ozone and stale diesel from my skin. I had slept, albeit fitfully, in a bed with warm sheets. I had reintegrated into the modern world of traffic, commerce, and conversation, but the data remained. The hard drives from the Sentinel mission sat on my desk, 4 black rectangular monoliths containing the digital ghost of the facility. They were cold to the touch, as if they still held the temperature of the sub-basement. I delayed the review process as long as professional protocol allowed. I filed the expense reports. I cataloged the equipment returns. I wrote the preliminary summaries of the structural degradation. I did everything except look at the raw files. But an analyst cannot ignore the data forever. The drives were not just storage, they were evidence. At 22 hours on a Tuesday, when the rest of the building was empty, I initiated the review. I sat at my workstation, the glow of the 3 monitors reflecting in my glasses, and connected the primary drive. The computer recognized the device immediately. A directory window popped up, listing the folders in neat, chronological order. Log, files, sensor, array, upper, sensor, array, lower, thermal, capture. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the thermal folder. The memory of the burning white hand pressing against the blast door was still vivid, a thermal burn on my own retinas. I needed to know if the camera had truly captured it, or if the stress of the isolation had caused a hallucination so potent it had overridden my visual cortex. I double-clicked the file labeled THCAM SEQ4. The video player opened. I leaned forward, bracing myself for the sight of the entity. The screen filled with static. It was not the clean, black and white snow of a signal loss. It was a violent, chromatic distortion. Pixels of neon green and purple tore across the frame. The time code in the corner was frozen at 0 hours. I ran a diagnostic on the file. The software returned a report instantly. Fatal data corruption, header information missing, magnetic media saturation. I tried the backup file. Corrupted. I tried the cache file. Corrupted. Every second of thermal video recorded during the encounter in the corridor had been destroyed. It was as if the camera had been exposed to a massive burst of electromagnetic radiation or an intense magnetic field that had scrambled the binary code of the video. The ghost had erased itself. Or perhaps, the reality of what I saw was simply incompatible with the digital format. The heat signature of a memory cannot be stored on a silicon chip. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by a deep, hollow sense of loss. I had no proof. If I told the review board what I had seen, without the video to back it up, I would be categorized as mentally unfit. I would be another victim of cabin fever, a rational man broken by the solitude of the North. I closed the video folder. I moved to the audio. Audio is harder to destroy. Sound waves are physical. They are vibrations captured by a diaphragm. Even if the digital file is damaged, the ghost of the sound often remains in the artifacts. I opened the folder, sensor, array, lower. I located the file recorded at the moment of the encounter. AUD, SUB, B2, 300 HRS. I put on my studio headphones, the same model I had worn in the dome, but clean, warm, and safe. I pressed play. The waveform on the screen was jagged. I heard the hiss of the noise floor, the amplified silence of the corridor. And then, the feedback whine. It started low and climbed rapidly, exactly as I remembered it, a piercing sine wave that pinned the meters into the red. I turned the volume down, wincing at the memory of the pressure in my ears, but I wasn't looking for the feedback. I was looking for what lay beneath it. I opened the spectral cleaning tools. I applied a notch filter to cut the specific frequency of the feedback squeal. I applied a declicker to remove the mechanical sound of the phantom typing. I stripped away the layers of noise, peeling back the acoustic interference like layers of an onion. I wanted to hear the room. I wanted to hear the air. I isolated a 5-second segment of audio just before the feedback loop began. It was the moment when the figure had turned to face me, the moment of the silence. I normalized the volume and looped the segment. At first, I heard only the digital artifacts of the processing, a watery, metallic, shimmering sound. But as my ears adjusted, I heard a voice. It was faint, tinny. It sounded like it was coming through a long copper wire, or from a radio speaker left on in another room. It was buried deep in the noise floor, perhaps negative 60 decibels below the ambient silence. I boosted the gain. I closed my eyes. The voice was male. It was calm. It was flat. It possessed the distinct, clipped accent of the mid-Atlantic broadcaster style common in the 1,950 seconds. Station keeping is nominal. Barometric pressure steady at 2998. External temperature -40. Shift log 492. All quiet on the wire. Over. I froze. I stopped the playback. I replayed it. All quiet on the wire. Over. It was not a message for me. It was not a warning. It was a log entry. I checked the date of the facility's operational history. I cross-referenced the shift logs I had scanned from the control room. I found the entry. Log 492, dated November 14th, 1958. The operator was listed as Sergeant Arthur Miller. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the silence of the lab pressing against my ears. The entity in the sub-basement wasn't a monster. It wasn't a demon. It was Sergeant Miller. He was simply reporting the weather. He was confirming that the station was keeping. He was doing his job. The horror of the realization was not sharp. It was a dull, heavy ache. The man had been dead for decades. The station had been abandoned for 40 years. The generators were frozen solid, but the loop remained. The duty remained. The energy I had felt, the heat that had burned through the blast door, was not malice. It was the sheer, unstoppable force of routine. It was the psychic weight of a man who had sat in the dark, night after night, watching a radar screen for a nuclear war that never came, until his very identity had been burned into the concrete and the steel. He was still there. He was still watching the wire, and I had interrupted him. I looked at the file on the screen. The waveform represented the only proof of the impossible. It was the smoking gun that would prove that the laws of physics were not absolute, that time could snag on a location like a skipped record. I moved the cursor to the file menu. I selected delete. A dialog box appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently delete this item? I clicked yes. The waveform vanished. The screen returned to a flat, gray blankness. I did not do it to protect the world. I did not do it to cover up a conspiracy. I did it because the alternative was unbearable. To acknowledge that the loop exists is to acknowledge that we can be trapped in it. To admit that Sergeant Miller is still typing in the dark is to admit that our labor does not end with our breath. I could not let that into the official record. The record must show that the building is dead. The record must show that the silence is empty. I opened the final report template. Subject: Sentinel Facility Assessment. Analyst: Elias Thorne. Status: Structural failure. I began to type. My fingers moved rhythmically on the keyboard. Click, clack, click, clack. Recommendation: Immediate burial. The structural integrity of the sub-basement levels is compromised. The concrete is porous. The foundation is shifting. Demolition is not advised due to the risk of environmental contamination and unstable geometry. I recommend the facility be collapsed inward using shaped charges and covered with a permanent aggregate cap. The site should be sealed. No further entry should be permitted. I printed the report. I signed it with a steady hand. I resigned from the Department of Decommissioned Infrastructure 2 weeks later. I cited cumulative hearing damage as the reason for my departure. It was not a lie. There are frequencies I can no longer tolerate. There are silences I can no longer endure. I live in the city now. I live near a highway. I keep a fan running in my bedroom at night. I need the noise. I need the chaos of the living world to drown out the memory of the order I found in the ice. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the traffic dies down and the fan oscillates to the side, I catch myself listening. I think about the Sentinel, buried now under tons of rock and snow, just as I recommended. I think about the crushing weight of the earth pressing down on the geodesic dome, flattening the steel, filling the voids, but I know that deep down, in the pockets of air that remain in the sub-basement, the pressure has not changed. The temperature is still constant, and I know that if you were to place a microphone against the crushed remains of the blast door, you would not hear the silence of the grave. You would hear the sound of a switch being thrown, chunk. You would hear the sound of a key being pressed, click. And you would hear the voice of a man who will never clock out, reciting the weather to a world that has long since stopped listening. All quiet on the wire. End of log. The archive is now closed, until we unseal the next file. Sleep well.